Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. Today I've got a 1997 Fender Made in Mexico jazz bass on the bench. As you know, I recently completed a couple of school projects and guitars that I wanted to donate to a school. So when I donated those, I dropped them off and the band director said, "Hey, I've got this old jazz bass that's got a bad jack." Well, it turns out this thing needs a little bit more work than just the jack, and I'll get some good photos in here to show you what it needs. So besides the jack, just about all of the screws on this guitar have significant corrosion. All the pickguard screws are corroded and some of them are even missing. So I will replace those so that they all match. There's corrosion beginning on the pull pieces for the pickups, so I'll clean that off too. The strings are significantly rusted and the frets themselves are actually starting to corrode. The fretboard's also going to need conditioning, and I'll take care of the fretboard and these frets at the same time. And the string nut is actually an interesting problem. I don't know if I'm going to address it yet or not, but the strings do not fit tightly in the nut, and I suspect that it might be worth replacing those if this is the gauge of strings that they prefer to use. The back of the bass looks pretty good, so I don't think I really need to do anything there. None of the tuners are bent, thankfully. There's some electronics here that I haven't been able to test because obviously the jack is not working. But as I get inside some of this stuff, I'm sure that the electronics will need cleaning, and I'll take care of that as well. So what we're doing today is a little bit of repair and a whole lot of just refurbishing and getting this thing nice and in good shape to play. We'll give it a good setup and then we'll get it back to these kids. All right, well the jack is at least fallen down inside here. I don't know if that means it's just missing a nut or if there's more going on, so we need to take this apart to see. Well, it's a nice enough jack and everything seems to be attached to it. So I think luckily this one is just missing a nut. So after checking it out, the jack is in good shape. It has the knurled washer on the back, and that was even the original one. It just fell inside the cavity. So I've just added a new nut to the outside and given it a good tightening. I'll also add a couple of new screws and complete the assembly. Okay, so skipping ahead a little bit, I went ahead and took the strings off and took the pickguard off, and I also took the screws out for the plate here and the bridge, and then I also took the knobs off. I only did the plate and the bridge because I wanted to polish up the chrome. This is semi-chrome. It's a paste polish and it works really well. Semi-chrome even works on some of the plastics, so I've been able to polish up some of the pickup covers and things like that. In doing so, I noticed a couple of things. First of all, the reason that some of these screws are coming out is because they're toothpicks that have been pushed into the holes and they weren't glued in or anything. So I'm going to go ahead and dowel and fill all these holes and re-drill them. That'll prevent any of these screws from falling out because a lot of them are just barely hanging on. Needless to say, somebody's been in here quite a bit doing a little bit of work before. I think the reason for that was because when I took these knobs off, I noticed that the shaft on this volume pot was pretty loose. And the reason for it was essentially that the bottom piece of the pot was starting to work its way off of the top of the pot. So the casing essentially was working its way off. Since I don't have a set of Fender jazz bass pots, and in particular this is a Deluxe jazz bass, so it's got all this garbage on here. But at any rate, I don't have this pot sitting around, so I just needed to bend the tabs back and secure them to the top of the pot so that now this bottom part doesn't come off. Hopefully that's enough to get this thing back in fighting shape because I don't know what all these pots actually do. I can tell that this one is a blending pot for the pickups, so it's kind of a pickup selector switch in a way. This one looks like a tone pot for a couple of different pickups. It's a concentric shaft pot, so it's got two different knobs on it, so I'm assuming it's an individual tone for each pickup. And that of course is a volume knob. I'm not 100% sure what this one is other than some fancy tone pot, so I'll probably have to look that one up online. Now that I'm looking at it, something else that's probably not doing this plate any favors is that this pot here got turned just a little bit so that this circuit board is hitting the side of the cavity. So I'm going to turn that back a little bit. I just have to loosen that nut to do it. There we go. That seems to fit a lot better. Well, it's a new day and I've been back at this bass a little bit. I've been doing some doweling of the holes and I'll show you the process of that in a second. I actually did a little bit of research on what this pickup set was and it was kind of surprising. Turns out John Sewer worked at Fender for a few years in the mid-90s and he designed this active bass pickup setup for this thing. It's pretty much the same one that's shared with the American model, although I think the American model may have double poles instead of single poles. The battery on this one happens to be good. It tested out okay. Everything seems to be working right now. I don't have strings on it to see how it sounds, but thankfully this thing is working because it's quite a complicated setup. Anyway, let's go ahead and get to the doweling and filling of these last 3 holes that I have here. I've done all of these and I just wanted to show you what they look like when they're done. Basically the process is glue a dowel in the hole. Once it's glued in, you cut it off. Once it's cut off, you put a little bit of super glue over the end of the dowel, and that super glue just seals it and helps level that little hole. And I usually just scrape it flat with a razor blade and I'm done. And since it's going under a pick guard, I don't need to polish it or anything. The only reason I do that leveling is because when I put the pick guard back on, I basically want to start from scratch, and I want to punch a little divot in each one of the holes to use as a guide for drilling a new pilot hole for the screw, and I don't want a uneven surface pulling my punch in one direction or another. Okay, so the process to dowel these holes is just to drill these out to 1/8 inch. I've got some 1/8 inch pieces of dowel rod here. These are bamboo. You can use whatever wood you want. But let's go ahead and get these drilled out. Now you don't really have to go very deep here, just deep enough so that you catch the bottom of the original hole. Okay, then we just need a little mixing surface. I'm going to put a little tight bond on it. Grab a little toothpick, put some glue down into those holes, mix it around. Then I'll take my dowel rod, roll the end of it into the glue, get some of the excess off of there, and then they just pop right in there. So I'll do that with the rest of these, and then we'll wait for those to dry. And don't forget to wipe off your excess glue now, because it makes it a lot easier than cleaning it up later. And while we're waiting on these 3 to dry, I'll show you on this dry one. I just take a razor blade and score the bottom of the dowel lightly. I don't want to score the finish, so the ends of this razor blade are taped. Once it's scored, you can just snap it off. Then it's fairly flat, but you can take your razor blade, come back in and just make sure. And that one did have a couple of little fibers that were sticking up. Then we just seal the ends of this with some super glue. It doesn't take that long for the super glue to dry, probably just about the same amount of time as the dowel rods, which I leave in place for at least 30 minutes before I cut them off. Okay, everything's doweled, filled, super glued, all that stuff, so I'm ready to reinstall this. I'm going to base the location of this off the previous holes and where it just kind of fits all the components the best, you know, so that the pickup has good movement. And I'm going to set 1 screw first. Okay, so I've set this 1 screw, and I've really done that so I can locate this plate, make sure it fits okay before I finalize everything. This pick guard has kind of moved over the years. It's actually got a little spring to it because it's a little bit warped, but it's the original, so I don't want to get rid of it. And because of where it's moved, this hole is just a little bit off, but it's going to be fine. There's plenty of meat there to take the new location. That gives a good amount of space on the sides so that the pots aren't touching the cavity. So we'll go ahead and lock it in. Everything's all locked in place now. I'll just do the last of these screws and then I'll come back when I'm done. Pick guard's mounted, control plate is mounted. I went ahead and reinstalled the knobs, and in doing so I realized that some things that I assumed earlier are incorrect. This is not in fact a volume knob. This is actually the volume knob, and it's attached to that preamp that I mentioned was designed by John Sewer. These appear to be some sort of separate treble and bass controls, like an equalizer, because they do change the tone. Although I don't have strings on here yet, I can kind of tell with the tap test. And there is a detent in the middle. So I think straight up is sort of like the 5 position, the normal position, and then you can go either way to your liking. Anyway, I've got these 3 kind of dialed in. Really not sure what this one is, but it also, after cleaning it, I realized it has a detent in the middle of it. So I don't know what sort of control that is. We'll find out when we string it. So I think the only thing really left to do next is the neck. So I'm going to do what I've done on some of my dirtier fretboards, and that's start with a first pass of Old English to try to just clean everything up, and then I'll finish up with some lemon oil. These frets are gross. Unbelievable. So just so we're clear, this is above and beyond a normal oiling. I normally wouldn't scrub the crap out of these frets with steel wool, but they have some serious corrosion issues going on. I'm getting all that off. It just takes a little bit of elbow grease. All right, I'm gonna give this wood a chance to rest a little bit after applying that Old English, and then I'll come back with some lemon oil. All right, the Old English is dried. No need for the steel wool at this point. Everything's nice and clean. Okay, now I'll let this dry, and I think next I'll decide what to do about that nut. All right, I've been thinking about this more than I probably should, but I'm kind of at the end of my patience with this base, so what I've decided to do, I'm gonna give this nut a couple of taps. If it comes out easy, I'm gonna replace it. If it doesn't, I'm gonna leave it. So that's what we're doing. All right, well that was easy enough, so I guess we're replacing a nut. So in terms of nut replacement, I started out with a bone blank, shaped it roughly, cut it to length, and then glued it in. I used a capo to clamp it in because capos are about the perfect shape for that. Then I held up the old nut next to it and drew some starter lines with a pencil and ultimately filed in some starter slots for each string. I'm getting pretty good at cutting these to depth without the strings on. It just involves putting a straight edge across the nut and the second fret and then measuring at the first fret. And if I do it that way, I'm shooting between 3 and 5 thousandths of an inch between the first fret and the straight edge. Typically, once I do it that way, once I string it up, I get 20 thousandths or less of action over the first fret. Now, of course, to check this permanently, I have to string it up, which you'll see me doing here. And then once I get all the strings in place, I've got to set the action. And it helps if the neck relief is set correctly too, so you want to check all these things kind of together. Then you can fine tune your nut slot. I know that all sounds complicated, but I have videos out there on slotting a nut or filing a nut. And the concept is really the same for guitar and bass. And of course I use my trusty Music Nomad files, which I have a review out there on. Now you'll also want to check out my video on jazz bass setup, because that is the next step that's required for this thing. Of course on this one I checked not only action and relief as I mentioned, but also intonation and pickup height. So there's a lot of settings involved and you don't want to skip any of those. After doing all that, and plugging this thing in and doing a quick test, and I'm not really a bass player so it's not worth a sound demo, but I can tell you this is a volume, this is a pickup selector blending knob basically, this is a treble knob on top and a bass knob on the bottom, so it's kind of an EQ setup here, and then this is actually a tone control for mids. Oh, and before I leave you, I'll make sure to include a picture of the finalized nut just to show you about how much string that I have sticking out of the top of the nut. I try not to seat the strings all the way down in the nut because I think that helps the most with tuning stability. So I'm kind of in a rush to get this thing back to the school because I'm sure they're wanting to see it, but I'm really happy with the way this thing turned out. Thank you all for hanging with me. I appreciate all the likes and all the comments that you give me. Make sure to check out the Hacks Guitar Hobby Facebook group and be sure to use my Amazon links. If you want to find the links to the Music Nomad files, the strings that I used, the bone nut, or any of the other parts that I may have used in this episode, be sure to check there. If you order something on Amazon using my links, it doesn't cost you any extra. But anyway, thanks again y'all. I appreciate the subscriptions and I'll see you guys next time.